Hello and welcome to the United Makes Football podcast. My name is Joe, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Keitel. We're also very lucky to be joined by a special guest. Greg Scott is a partner at the law firm Memery Crystal, and in this role, he's helped advise on the sale of West Bromwich Albion back in 2016. And more recently, together with the likes of Gary Neville, Andy Burnham, and even Denise Lewis, to name a few of the people, he is a part of Our Beautiful Game, a campaign to reform football by creating an independent regulatory body. And like most of our guests these days, he's an Arsenal fan too, although I suspect not a very happy one at present. Greg, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and thank you for having me on. It's an honour and a privilege, and yes, not too much enjoying the football at the moment, but I guess that's the pain of being a genuine supporter. And we had it our own way for many years, and we haven't had it our own way for a few years now. So we're having to get used to that.
Yes, yeah, no, as you mentioned, we're sort of in the mire these days, but yeah, Greg, it's great to have you with us. It's always a pleasure to chat with a fellow Gooner. We do tend to like to kick off the podcast with an icebreaker, and going off of something that Joe mentioned in your intro, Memery Crystal, obviously that's the company you work for. And when I had a look through their Twitter, I noticed that their profile image is a light bulb. So of course that's usually sort of significant of like a eureka moment or just good ideas in general. But to take it more literally, when somebody isn't very handy, you might say that they can hardly screw in a light bulb. So I'm curious to know, Greg, for me personally, IKEA furniture is probably where I tap out. That's about as much as I can handle. But I wanted to know, what is your proudest DIY accomplishment? What's the best thing that you've ever built?
Goodness me. I am, anyone who knows me well will agree that I am the worst side of hopeless when it comes to anything DIY related. And that it's even more unforgivable because my father was brilliant at DIY and could put cupboards together and lay carpets and all sorts of things. I think my proudest DIY moment is successfully screwing in a light bulb and it actually working when I flick the switch on. I did once assemble a barbecue, which took me about 2 hours and ended up with my hands bleeding from several sort of cuts. And at the end of it all, there was this rubber tube, which I thought, surely that's supposed to go somewhere. But anyway, we used it for about 20 years and it never blew up. So I guess maybe that's my proudest achievement.
Yeah, I'd say that counts. When it comes to screwing in a light bulb, I've actually electrocuted myself doing it. So, easier said than done, I guess, for some. But Joe, how about yourself? What's your proudest DIY achievement?
Yeah, I'm not very practical. I also nearly electrocuted myself at university once, or one of my housemates nearly electrocuted me, I should say. But I also, I once put a sort of desk chair together, and it took me, I don't know, the best part of a day. I'm awful, so I'm hoping that I'll just leave the DIY to other people in future. But away from the DIY, as you may recall, earlier, I did let it slip that Greg is an Arsenal fan, much like Keitel. But Greg, tell me, what are your earliest memories of supporting the Gunners, and why did they become the club for you?
Well, actually, it's quite a funny story as you know, I'd love to tell a story that I was born next to the ground, you know, listening. My earliest sounds were listening to the crowd roaring, but in fact, it was nothing like that. My father was and still is a proud Spurs supporter. He was actually brought up in Edmonton, a stone's throw away from White Hart Lane. But his cardinal sin was to be too busy and not take me to any game. So when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I do remember this, I decided that I had to support a football team. So the Sunday Times back then didn't have a separate sports section. The sports was on the inside back cover of the main paper. And I came running into my father one Sunday morning. He was having his breakfast saying, "I'm going to support Leeds United." And he said, "Well, why on earth do you want to support Leeds United?" And I said, and this will also make you smile, because they're top of League Division 1 as it was then. My father gave me a good philosophical lesson. He said, well, just because they're top now, and this was early in the season, doesn't mean they'll finish top. So I thought, sound advice, went back to the paper and saw that Arsenal were second. So I said, it's Arsenal. And my father never tried to stop me. And actually, to be truthful, I wasn't a mad, passionate supporter until my kids were born. Joe, you know all about Daniel and Matthew, and
Indeed.
them that they wanted to go to more matches, and that got me into going more, and that happily coincided with a very good run of form for the Arsenal team. That's where it all really comes from. So really, I started going in earnest in, I guess, 96, 97, and from then. So that was a great era.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear your father's warning about not just going for the team at the top of the tree. So I think any people who these days are considering finding a club and they see Tottenham at the top of the table, don't pick them yet, because inevitably they're not going to be up there at the end of the season, according to Greg's father. What a wise man, yeah.
There's a nice bit of symmetry there. It's nice to see Leeds, genuinely nice to see Leeds back in the top flight of football, I think, where they've been absent for too long. And I'm not sure if Bielsa is a genius or a madman, but it's good to watch them play anyway.
It is good to have them back. I mean, historically, the last time they were in the Premier League before they came up this time, they used to beat Arsenal a few times. I think they cost us the league one season, and obviously we didn't win at Ellen Road this time either. But sticking on Arsenal, and you mentioned, Greg, that you sort of started going in the late 90s, but which is sort of, when Arsene Wenger sort of showed up, essentially. But it sounds like you were a fan before then. So during that Arsene Wenger era, though, we were kind of spoiled as Arsenal fans. We sort of got to have our cake and eat it too, in the sense that the football was really good to watch and it brought trophies. Whereas these days we're pretty cakeless, so to speak. So I guess I was curious to know, now that the romance of the prime Wenger days is really well and truly in our past, is there any spirit in the current squad or any values at the club that to this day link all the way back from now through the Wenger era to before that, when you started supporting Arsenal?
I think that's a very good question. I would say there are certain values, and I think one of those is, and obviously it's been sorely tested the last few years, but I think one of those is actually faith in doing things the right way, in continuity. You look at, I suspect Chelsea are now going to have a few stable years, but you look at the sort of turnover of managers they had before Frank Lampard arrived, and the sort of 10 years before that. I don't know how many managers they went through in those 10 years, but probably as many as the years. And that was never the Arsenal way. I think there's still a strong local community spirit at Arsenal. I think they've been one of the pioneers of doing sort of voluntary and charitable work in the community. And it's just it's an old club with a proud history. And I guess that's what keeps people like me still going when we can go, and sort of grimacing when we don't get the results. For me, I was never that upset if we lost when we should have won and we played lovely football. For me, what hurts more is not being at the races, is not playing well. And unfortunately, I think the game against Spurs on the weekend illustrated. we were just sort of outclassed in all aspects of the game, tactically, technically, flair, and that can hurt, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm right here with you, suffering as an Arsenal fan these days. So yeah, hopefully we can turn it around sooner rather than later. I guess the January transfer window is close. That could be a good opportunity for us to find a few quick fixes, maybe, but we'll see. So let's move on to, well, I guess we'll go back to something that Joe had mentioned, but we'll move on to sort of the legal side of football. And as we mentioned earlier, of course, Greg, you're a lawyer, and whilst football begins as a game for all of us in our childhood, it's just a bit of fun. Once you're talking about the professional game of football in England, there's so many moving parts and there's so much money at stake that inevitably there is a big legal and governing presence in the game. Big clubs will have entire legal teams of their own, and then the FA, PFA, and LMA are some examples of the bodies charged with maintaining standards across the league. So that's the state of the game today. But along with our guest Greg, Joe had mentioned that the likes of Gary Neville, even David Bernstein, who's the former chairman of the FA, have come together to drive the Our Beautiful Game campaign forward. Again, to reference, the campaign's agenda is to sort of redistribute the huge amounts of money gifted to Premier League clubs to those further down the footballing pyramid, instead, where the impact it can have will be greater for the holistic well-being of football in England. Beyond looking to reverse some of this inequality when it comes to funding, the campaign is also striving to establish a new regulatory body in association with UK Parliament to stamp out any corruption that may be occurring within the currently existing bodies. So Greg, I hope that wasn't too far off the mark as far as the gist of things, but could you tell us a little bit more about
Sure.
the beautiful game? And then also, how did you come to be involved in the campaign in the first place?
Well, let's start with that maybe. David Bernstein was already a client of mine on a couple of projects. He's got a background in all sorts of businesses. He was joint chief executive for many years at Pentland Group, who bought Reebok and was spectacularly successful. So I already knew David, and he called me up, I think it was pretty early on in the lockdown, totally out of the blue, said, we're putting this campaign together. You're a sensible chap. I think he didn't just want footballers and politicians on the panel. Would you like to join? And I thought about it for about 30 seconds and then said, yes, why not? It's nothing I'd ever done before. It was interesting. And I have to say the people on that steering group are great. I mean, they're a revelation. I mean, you would expect Sir Mervyn King, who's former governor of the Bank of England, to be a smart cookie. But, Gary Neville holds his own and comes out with some very perceptive observations. And you have to take your hat off to him. He is spending an enormous amount of time doing sort of voluntary and unpaid work in the sort of football ecosystem. He gives of his time. He obviously knows his subject matter, and he's got some very interesting angles. So, between having Gary Neville, people like Andy Burnham, who was, a Labour minister and is now mayor of Manchester, and David himself, who's a very sort of serious operator. It's been an eye opener. It's been very interesting. And I think in terms of your summary, the only thing I take slight issue with is sort of the idea of redistribution of wealth. We're not sort of Robin Hoods, sort of going up to, with a sort of a shotgun to the gates at Manchester City saying, you've got far too much money, give it to these poor clubs down the road. It's more about looking at football as an ecosystem. And, where are Man City getting their players from? If they take a player from a championship side, where's that championship side getting its players from? How much are they paying for them? Can they sustain that in terms of the wages that they're paying with the revenues that they're getting? And if the ecosystem doesn't hold, and COVID, of course, has produced a situation where a lot of clubs are sadly very close to financial collapse, then I think you're just going to find a very small elite group of clubs spending more and more and more just to stand still. And that creates a spiral for the other clubs that are hanging on for dear life, who can only squeeze 10,000 into their ground at prevailing ticket prices, don't have a global brand that they can monetize with merchandising and broadcasting rights, and yet have to pay higher and higher prices for the decent players. And I think what we're trying to do is say, look, the ecosystem starts with the grassroots, it goes up through the leagues to the Premiership. The ecosystem has to be healthy, or the clubs in the middle are gonna wither and die, basically.
Just to hang on that and play sort of, I guess, devil's advocate for a moment. We're in a unique situation in England as a place that people look to as sort of, the birthplace of football, or at least of modern football as we know it. And on top of that, we have so many leagues, including the conference, well, what used to be known as the conference, now the National League. Is it natural for any country to be able to sustain that big of a sort of interest in football from the top to, essentially grassroots level? You don't really see other countries with as many leagues taken as seriously as England. So I guess, the question is it natural in the 21st century for us to expect these clubs to be able to maintain?
The answer to that is, I mean, we did discuss this, and I must confess, I don't know how the leagues go down through the sort of the different tiers in places like France and Germany. But certainly we did have this discussion that there is no club has a divine right to exist. There's no doubt that there may have been areas of the country that were prospered and had huge population increase during the Industrial Revolution and supported 5 or 6 reasonably top flight clubs where maybe it doesn't justify it anymore. And I think, so we're not saying there have to be X number of clubs, but I think what we are saying is that without some care and attention and a slightly fairer, not just fairer distribution of income, but also just taking a bit more care over the grassroots and the academies and the training. Without that, I think you're going to see a dramatic reduction in clubs. And, people say, why is football different from any other competitive business? Part of the answer is that, these are real communities. And in some of these communities where there is a lot of unemployment, there isn't a lot of prosperity, the football club is really the cultural focus of the town. The whole town comes alight on I was going to say Saturday night, but it might equally be a Friday or a Monday these days when their team wins. And it's a severe blow to local pride and also the businesses that thrive off the football clubs if they go to the wall. And that's where we see football as being a bit different from just any other business.
Yeah, I can't agree more.
Yeah, no, I think football is very different to most other businesses. And obviously, our beautiful game are ultimately, looking for there to be an independent regulatory body. But if that wasn't possible, or if that became too much of a challenge, do you have confidence, Greg, that kind of the current bodies in place, like the FA, like the Football League, the Premier League, whatever in this country, do you think at the very least your campaign can help these bodies improve to a point where they're more fit for purpose? Or in the sort of current structure of the game as you and our beautiful game see it, is the only way how football can ultimately progress in this country is with this independent regulatory body? How important is it that it exists?
It's not a given that you have to have an independent regulator to have a sort of a well-run administration of football in this country, but there's been something like 25 years or more of government recommendations pushing towards reform, and in the last 10 years pushing towards an independent regulator. And the FA has just failed to respond. It's always been reactive. It's always been, I would say, cosmetic changes. It's got a very unwieldy sort of system of administration, so I think we came to the conclusion that it's not impossible in theory, but it probably is in practice. And I think what's happened with COVID sort of illustrates it. You have a situation, for example, where the FA has on paper significant rule-making powers, but it's effectively funded by the Premier League. And the EPL revenue is about 12 times that of the FA. So guess who gets to call the shots? So there's soft power being exercised there, not always necessarily in a deliberately malevolent way. We don't see, the head of the Premier League as a sort of Bond, a fluffy white cat, to impose his will on the governance of football. But it doesn't make for transparent and consistent decision making. And I think you saw that with COVID. And with Project Big Picture, everyone was maneuvering and everyone was sort of saying, well, here you go, National League, have a bit of money and then give us this. And it was all very piecemeal. It was a bit of it had the feel of a bit of a land grab. Imagine if you had a regulator in there that actually was supposed to operate on a set of principles. Now, you could argue about whether those principles were being fairly implemented or what weight should be given, but at least you'd have a starting point. And that regulator would be accountable to the various stakeholders in football and ultimately to Parliament if it turned out not to be fit for purpose. So that's really where we're coming from.
Fantastic. Well, obviously we wish you the best of your campaign, and hopefully, we'll be hearing more about that, and maybe we'll be seeing you on Monday Night Football with Gary Neville at some point. But yeah, going away from our beautiful game and actually going on to talking a bit about some of the work you've done with West Brom. So I know for years you've you advised Jeremy Peace, who used to be the owner, and you were involved in advising him on the sale of West Brom back in 2016, I believe.
2016, yeah.
So
there's a nice story, by the way. Those who are lawyers or transactional advisors will get this. We had been negotiating for weeks and weeks and weeks, which is pretty typical of these sorts of deals. They're complicated, they take time. And the date for signing had been pushed back again and again. And eventually we landed on a date, and we realized it was the date of the announcement of the referendum result to Brexit, basically, whether or not we left the EU. And the advisors we had a chat, and we said, well, what happens if we leave? Will that impact the deal? And everyone said, it's not even worth talking about. It's never going to happen. And I woke up on the morning, putting my suit and tie on to go to the exchange meeting, put on the BBC News to hear Dimbleby saying, well, the country's spoken and the news is we're out. And I won't tell you what I then said, but my wife can remember. But amazingly, the deal still happened. So sorry to cut across you and digress there. But
no, very infamous day now. Yeah, obviously, as we've kind of established, away from your profession, you are a football fan as well. So when you're kind of working on these deals, does this add an extra element of excitement to what you're doing? And how different is working on, or advising, I should say, on the sale of a football club compared to maybe advising on the sale of something else from a different industry?
It's a good question. I mean, on one level, it's the same. You have a seller who wants to get as much money as possible. You have a buyer who wants to sort of walk away without any risk after the deal. You have a buyer that wants to pay as little as possible and have as many safeguards and warranties as possible. And the buyer's going to, kick the tires. They're going to look at in this case, the player contracts. They're going to look at the stadium, the sponsorship agreements. So to that extent, it's like any other deal, but it's not like any other deal in a number of respects. I need to choose my words a little bit carefully, but I think the West Brom sale was an example of a buyer that was perhaps more motivated by the status of owning a football club than the hard financial criteria. I think what you're seeing, of course, it was a Chinese buyer, and there were quite a few Chinese buyers in town at the time. What you're now seeing is largely US-based funds, some of them actually based out near where you are, I think, Keitel, in LA. But they will only buy if it makes sense. I mean, they will be running the proverbial slide rule over the target to make sure that it really does work. And if the price demanded is $1 too high, then they won't engage. So I think that has changed. I think it's also it's emotive, and I think there's enormous pressure. There was enormous pressure on Jeremy Peace as owner to preserve the heritage of the club. And for example, something you wouldn't see in a normal contract, there were provisions about the strip. He didn't want the team playing in pink hoops, for example. He wanted it to remain the broad blue stripes. We wanted to make sure that Jeff Astles, who was one of their iconic players, I think there's a statue of him, or there's something on one of the gates there, that was kept and wasn't dismantled or changed. So I think you have a lot of heritage issues. And of course, you also had the local press wildly speculating, and some of the national press usually getting it completely wrong, but who cares if it makes a good story. And of course, the fans jumping on those stories and demanding answers to questions. So there's a bit more heat on management and owners in the sale of a football club than selling your widget factory, if you like. And again, it's the local community in whose hands is this prize asset going to be. It's also very different in the sense that, and I don't want to get too technical and too boring about this, most businesses have a working capital cycle. They buy things, they sell things, they're owed money, they have cash in the bank. And most buyers try to grab a point in time and they say, well, we'll pay X, providing you're not in debt. And if you've got excess cash, you can have the cash. But if there's excess debt, we're taking it off the price. Very difficult with a football club for two reasons. One is, if you buy at a certain time of year, all the money's gone out the door in transfer fees. If you buy at another time of year, all the season ticket receipts are in, and you haven't yet bought any players. So the working capital fluctuates wildly. And the other big difference longer term is relegation. This is something that a lot of US investors have struggled to get their heads around, because I think it's not a feature of a lot of big American sport. You know, the idea that you could pay X for a Premier League club, and in a few weeks' time they might be, or next season they might be in the Championship, and perhaps a couple of seasons after that they might be in League One. I mean, how does that work as a planning, as a business model? So that also puts things in a very different perspective.
It would be really interesting to have you as a fly on the wall for the Sunderland Till I Die documentary that's been going on. I'm sure you'd have a lot of opinions on the business that's been taking place up there. But otherwise,
I actually used to act. I did act for Sunderland for a couple of years as well, actually.
Okay. Well, hopefully you weren't responsible for any of that. No, I'm just joking.
Away from the selling of clubs to the sale of players. So, Greg, I know, I understand that you've advised on the fallout of a transfer before. And given how many stakeholders are involved in football transfers, are you surprised there aren't more legal problems arising from these seemingly really complicated and often from the outside quite murky looking deals? I mean, you only have to look at like the Carlos Tevez Mascherano one from a few years ago with third party people involved. And I mean, look, most deals, the agent fees you hear about and stuff. Yeah. Are you surprised that you haven't sort of had to advise on more of these matters? And yeah, what is just your general feeling from a legal perspective on how transfers are conducted?
I think I get the impression, I'm not an expert on this. I was, when I was acting for West Brom, there was I better not say who it was, but it was a fairly well-known player who I think actually came from, I think West Brom bought him from Sunderland, and there was an issue over appearance money and also sponsorship. I think a lot of these issues get settled between the club chairman. So I think there are frequent bust-ups, but we don't necessarily get to hear about them. I think there is also an internal arbitration system that deals with them. So you're not necessarily seeing these things going to the High Court. But I think what has been a persistent problem is the agents. I'm not saying there isn't a role for agents, but I think for many years there hasn't been enough regulation, and I think there's been too many disreputable agents. And I think it probably still goes on where, agents have a vested interest in churning their assets. You might have, 3 or 4 star players. They're not doing you any good by staying at the same club for 5 years. So I think the agents have a vested interest in agitating, in getting into the ear of the players and perhaps making them feel that they're not being properly respected when they're perhaps not getting much first team action. And I think that is an issue. And I think too much money in the game of football has ended up in I'm going to be very unpopular with some people here, has ended up in the pockets of agents, which could have been put to better use.
I can't argue with that. At the end,
but I have to confess, it's a gut feel. It's not something I know. I'm not an expert on the way that works.
Yeah, obviously football's evolved, and these agents wouldn't have been around, say, 30 years ago, and there still would have been great players making their way through the game. I'm sure it's contributed to a lot of positives from the players' side of things, taking a lot of pressure off their shoulders when it comes to decision making and whatnot. But as you alluded to as well, there's maybe some dodgy, not necessarily dodgy, but maybe the best intentions aren't always what is being used to make this.
Well, there were dodgy. I mean, let's be honest. There were some very dodgy agents. I do think the situation has improved. If I look at the situation now compared to what it was 10 years ago, I think it seems to be more transparent and more regulated than it was, I have to say.
Yeah, Joe and I are fortunate to have become sort of friendly with a few agents through the podcast, and they definitely are flying the flag in terms of how to do it the right way. But moving on to, or back to Arsenal, I guess, just before we sort of wrap things up for today. We're actually presently recording a couple days before the Dundalk game, which is a dead rubber, as we can't not come top of the group and they can't not come bottom of the group. So I'm sure that's just going to be the kids playing Thursday. Yes. But moving on to the Premier League, where we sit in 15th place, having lost in the North London derby at the weekend to Spurs, who, of course, as you mentioned earlier, Greg, are in first. But as your dad referenced, they won't be by the time the season's over. This podcast is going to be out on Friday. And that's a couple days before we face one of the few teams in the league who are actually below us, along with West Brom, but it's Burnley. So Burnley have taken 1 point from Arsenal since 2009, home or away. And Sunday's game is at the Emirates. Typically a home fixture for Arsenal would be a good thing this season, who knows? But Greg, how do you see the game going? And then sort of, beyond that, obviously every game at this point seems like it could be a potential catalyst to reignite our season. But on the flip side, if we don't win, do you think that Arteta's job could be at stake on the weekend if we don't pick up all 3 points?
I guess there's a point if we do so badly that the board will have no choice. I think that would be very sad. I think that there's an enormous amount of work to be done with this Arsenal team. I think there's been a little bit of bad luck. I think all clubs can cite injuries. I think at the end of last season you had players like Martinelli who were really a revelation, scoring lots of goals. I think David Luiz has, he's a mercurial player, but I think he's great when he's on form. I think Partey is a fantastic signing, although possibly was bought back. Well, it would seem he was bought back too soon against Spurs, and I worry how long he'll be out for now. I think there's also there's a lot of talent there. I think Smith Rowe, Maitland-Niles, Nketiah, I'm yet to be totally convinced about, but I think Saka is a star in the making. But there's a lot of young players. They're not quite there yet, but they're very nearly there. And I think just a certain something needs to click, and we'll be a totally different sort of team. My one criticism of Arteta would be, I think, a slight lack of boldness. I think we know how Burnley will set up, but I think Arsenal really, really have to go at them. And I think that there's a distinct lack of confidence in the team. I think there are too many players looking backwards rather than forwards. I don't want to name and shame them, but there are players playing below par at the moment as well. I think I think he's a great player, but Bellerin at the moment is not. I don't think he's playing nearly at his best. I think Xhaka is just playing far too many square balls. William's been a disappointment apart from the first game, but these things can change. Perhaps we've almost got too many options, and Arteta just needs to settle down the team. So I'm not despairing just yet, and I think the Arsenal way is to stick with the manager. I like Arteta. I think he's. Of course, the other tragedy is Ozil. Really, I will never quite understand how someone that gifted has ended up not even being registered. But I also understand managers have to manage. And not be dictated to by players. So I think there's a whole host of factors that have put Arsenal where they are now. I am quietly confident. I'm not deluded. I think there's a lot of work to do, but I don't think we're going to finish in 15th place. Let's put it that way.
No, hopefully we can climb at least into the top half of the table.
Yeah. We might end up being relegated and get into the Champions League. I don't know if that's ever happened before.
Champions League football would be nice. I don't know about Championship football, but I guess let me just to hang on something quickly. And inevitably, any Arsenal or any podcast that talks about Arsenal and talks about Ozil, everyone's had these conversations. But I guess considering your background and the fact that you were talking about power of agents and whatnot, what do you make of the Ozil situation from, I guess, sort of like a legal standpoint, and just, is there a way that this could have been avoided? It seems like all of the power is in Ozil's hands. He's getting as much money as he was ever going to get, bar appearance fees and, assist fees, whatever those bonuses are. And he hasn't lifted a finger. How has modern football allowed this to happen at any club?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's difficult. Obviously, Ozil has a contract, and in that contract, Arsenal agree to pay him, and Ozil agrees to make himself available to play. Where I think these contracts fall down, if you compare them, if you look at a normal employment contract, as well as turning up for work, you've actually got to be able to do your job, and an employer can fire you if you don't. If you frequently turn up late, or you keep pressing the wrong button and losing the company loads of money, you'll get fired. It's very difficult to say to and I'm not suggesting this is even the case with Ozil, but you can't really say to a footballer, you're not good enough, therefore you've breached your contract. we knew what we were buying. It's up to the club and the coaching staff and the management as to what position to play them and where they fit in. I think, unfortunately, I suspect Ozil is very opinionated. I think he's difficult. I think he feels disrespected if someone criticizes him, and I think there's possibly a little bit of petulance there. And I think that has been encouraged by the money that has been lavished on him. And let's not forget, he is a world-class and recognized as such player. Whether it was ever really right to bring someone like Ozil into the Premier League is another question. But Arsenal were the team that did it, and if they think it didn't work out, then I guess it's their problem.
Yeah, it was fun for a little bit.
But I mean, as my son Daniel, Joe, you know Daniel very well, often pointed out when people were criticising Ozil, he'd say, "Well, you're criticising him, but actually he's got the most assists in the Premiership." And I think that was part of the problem with Ozil. The stats don't lie, and yet somehow people felt he wasn't pulling his weight, and that's maybe partly to do with the kind of blood and guts tempo of the Premiership as opposed to European football.
Yeah, I've definitely heard Daniel relate those stats to me before, and I mean, from a Spurs fan's perspective, it's been great that he's not been playing, because he's obviously a fantastic player, but there's clearly something not right there, and probably for the best you get ASAP as things are going on. But I do have one final question for you, Greg, and I'll end on a very serious question. I call it a moral dilemma, perhaps. So if Daniel Levy ever came to you wanting advice on a legal matter for Spurs, would you be prepared to help out and advise him, or instead would you have to follow your Gooner instincts and sabotage Spurs in some way or another?
No, I'm sure I wouldn't be able to. I'd have to make a little joke, probably after he'd signed my engagement letter and agreed to pay my exorbitant fees. But no, of course, I would. It's a job, and we can all. I think football is great for banter and conversation, but let's get real. If he came to me and said, "I want you to act for Spurs," I'd very happily do it. Take a lot of stick from a lot of people. But actually, on a similar theme, and I'm probably going to get killed for saying this, our founding partner at our law firm, so as you said, Memery Crystal, Peter Crystal, I hope he won't mind me saying this, passionate Leeds United supporter. And we were interviewing someone for quite an important role. This is many years ago. And Peter said, "So," he goes, "Oh, lovely." He goes, what team do you support?" And the guy said, "Manchester United." And he went, "Oh, no." And he started having a go at this guy. And afterwards, I said to Peter, "Peter, we're trying to recruit him, not scare him." But it ran so deep that I think for him, football transcended everything. So the passion is good, but let's keep a sense of perspective.
Very, very noble of you. I think, well, I'm obviously not a lawyer. I don't know what I'm doing. I'd probably say don't ask me to advise you. But I don't know. Working for Arsenal in some form, I don't think I could do it. But
I'd never act for Chelsea though.
We can all agree on that. That's what we always say. The one thing Keitel and I can agree on is we both hate Chelsea. So that's something that's good. But that actually that brings us to the end of the interview today. So firstly, a big thank you to my co-host Keitel. And then obviously a massive thank you to Greg Scott too for being such a great guest. Greg,
thank you.
Oh no, thank you. What is the best way for our listeners to keep up to date with everything that you're getting up to?
Well, on the Our Beautiful Game campaign, there is a website, ourbeautifulgame.co.uk, and we will be updating that with what we're trying to do at the moment is find a path through a very busy parliamentary schedule to get a private members bill to really get the ball rolling in earnest for an independent regulator. I think we recognise that government's got a few other weighty issues on its hands at the moment, what with COVID and Brexit and all the rest of it. So that may take some time. We've had a meeting with the Football Supporters Association and found common ground on a lot of items that they're backing. So we're really just trying to build support, build consensus, drive it through Parliament, and go on the website and have a look at some of the stats and some of the updates. And I guess read the sports pages, because there's going to be quite a lot more on this, I think, in the next few months.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, as we said, we'll be keeping an eye on it, and I'm sure our listeners will be too. Finally, for our listeners, if you've enjoyed this and you want to follow us, we're on social media. We're at United Mates FP on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook even too. And you can subscribe to us on YouTube. Just type in United Mates Football Podcast. That is all for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.